"You build rockets and cars, Dad. Why can't you build time for me?" Elon Musk sat frozen in a church pew as his 6-year-old son spoke those words to a silent congregation. What followed left Elon in tears and the world stunned. What did X say next that changed his father's heart forever? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. Sunday morning light filtered through the kitchen window, casting long streaks across the breakfast table. Elon Musk sat across from his 6-year-old son X, both of them quietly eating cereal. The only sound was the clink of spoons against ceramic bowls. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, just routine. It had become normal between them, words saved for later, emotions tucked away. X looked up suddenly, eyes bright and wide with a seriousness that felt out of place for someone so small. "Dad, can we go to church today?" he asked. Elon blinked, caught off guard. "Church?" he repeated. "Why would you want to go there?" X played with his spoon, avoiding his father's eyes. "My friend at school said it's where people go when they need help with big feelings." Elon paused, studying his son. He hadn't expected this, not today, not ever really. But something in X's expression stopped him. The kid wasn't being cute. He was being honest, searching. 2 hours later, Elon sat stiffly in a wooden pew at a small church on the east side of Austin. It wasn't a place he'd ever imagined himself. Simple architecture, soft lighting, stained glass windows that cast dancing colors across the carpet. The congregation was small, kind. No one stared, no one whispered. X sat quietly beside him, his eyes locked on the front altar. Elon, on the other hand, kept shifting. His fingers tapped on his knee, his eyes flicked to his watch again and again. His mind wandered to emails, projects, deadlines. But beside him, X didn't move. He was still, focused, at peace. And that, more than the setting, more than the service, unsettled Elon the most. Something was happening here, something he didn't yet understand. The pastor stepped forward, smiling gently at the congregation. "Before we close today," he said, "I want to open the floor. If anyone here feels something on their heart, something they've been carrying, now is the time to share it. Sometimes just speaking it aloud can bring healing." Elon shifted slightly in the pew, only half listening. He glanced at his phone, still on silent, tempted to check his messages. But before he could, he felt a gentle tug on his sleeve. "Dad," X whispered, "I want to go up there." Elon looked at him, startled. "What? No, buddy, you don't have to. We can just sit and listen." But X was already moving. He scooted past his father, into the aisle, walking straight toward the front of the church. Elon sat frozen, unsure of what to do, heart suddenly pounding in his chest. The pastor noticed the small boy approaching and met him with a kind smile. He brought over a step stool and helped X up behind the wooden podium. The sanctuary fell completely silent. X gripped the edges of the pulpit, looked out at the unfamiliar faces, and took a deep breath. "My name is X Musk," he began, his voice clear and steady, "and I want to talk about my dad." As X stood at the front of the church, his small hands gripping the edges of the pulpit, Elon felt the world around him slow. The soft rustle of programs, the creak of wooden pews, everything faded into the background. His focus locked completely on the boy at the front, his son, who now seemed much older than 6. In that moment, Elon's mind drifted backward. He thought about the past year, how much had changed since the divorce. He remembered the long meetings, the red-eye flights, the relentless schedule that never seemed to pause. He remembered X's quietness in the car rides, the missed dinners, the evenings when his son asked to play but he'd answered with, "maybe later." He remembered the birthday. He had been in Shanghai on a critical project launch. He couldn't make it back in time. So instead, he'd sent X a custom-built robot, programmed to speak, dance, and even flip. It had cost a fortune and arrived in a massive high-tech box. He'd assumed it would be the highlight of X's day. Now, as he listened to his son speak in front of strangers, Elon realized something painful. X hadn't wanted the robot. He had wanted his father. Elon looked at the small boy standing at the pulpit. Not just his son, but a person who had been quietly carrying questions and pain he hadn't even noticed. Questions about love, about time, about presence. He had been so focused on being the man who builds the future that he hadn't seen how much of the present he'd been missing. For the first time, Elon didn't see X as a child needing to be entertained or managed. He saw a soul trying to reach him, trying to be heard. And now, in the quiet of that sanctuary, the message was coming through louder than anything he'd ever engineered. X stood tall, at least as tall as a 6-year-old could on a wooden step stool. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice stayed steady. He looked out over the church pews, his eyes landing only briefly on his father before returning to the faces of the congregation. "My dad is really smart," X began. "He builds things, rockets, cars, robots. He says he's trying to help the world." A few people in the pews smiled kindly, some nodding in recognition. Elon shifted uncomfortably, feeling their eyes brush over him. He didn't move. He couldn't. "But sometimes," X continued, "he forgets about me." That one sentence landed with a quiet thud. The air in the room grew still. Whispers began to stir at the edges of the congregation, but no one interrupted. X swallowed hard, then went on. "For my birthday," he said, "my dad sent me a robot. It could do flips and talk. It was really cool." Elon remembered the robot, remembered spending hours designing it with one of his top engineers. He had imagined X's face lighting up with joy. "I gave it back to the delivery man," X said softly. A collective murmur rose from the crowd. Elon felt it, eyes turning toward him again. Not out of judgment, out of concern, out of heartbreak. I didn't want a robot," X said, his voice more fragile now. "I just wanted to have breakfast with my dad." Elon's heart squeezed tight in his chest. He didn't breathe. X looked down for a moment, then raised his head again. "My friend at school told me church is where people go to talk about big feelings," he said. "I have big feelings." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Sometimes it feels like my dad wants to save the whole world, but not my little world. My world is just me and him. And sometimes it feels like I'm not in it." Gasps whispered through the crowd. A few people covered their mouths. A mother held her child closer. An elderly man shook his head slowly, blinking back emotion. Elon felt exposed. Completely and utterly exposed. He had given speeches to heads of state, launched rockets into space, faced down critics and competitors alike, but nothing made him feel as raw as this moment. X continued, his voice quiet but unwavering. "I know my dad is busy," he said. "I know he does important things, but..." He hesitated, then looked directly at Elon. "You build rockets and cars, Dad. Why can't you build time for me?" The room fell silent again. No coughs, no shifting, just the weight of a 6-year-old's truth, spoken into still air. Elon's eyes welled up. He hadn't cried in years, but this wasn't rebellion. It wasn't a tantrum. It was a plea. A small voice asking not for toys or fame, but for presence, for attention, for love. X looked down at his shoes, then back up. "That's all I wanted to say," he finished quietly. "Thank you for listening." And with that, he stepped back from the pulpit. The pastor helped him down, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Elon sat frozen in the pew, tears silently trailing down his cheeks. For the first time, he wasn't sure what to do next. But he knew one thing for certain. He was listening now. As X stepped down from the podium and returned to the pew, the sanctuary remained hushed. People watched him walk, their expressions a mixture of admiration, sorrow, and something deeper, recognition. When he reached Elon, he didn't sit right away. Instead, he turned to face the congregation once more. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice softer now. "I talk to a counselor at school, every Tuesday, during lunch." Elon blinked, his breath caught in his throat. This was news to him, completely. He glanced at his son, stunned. "My mom set it up," X explained. "She said it would help me with my feelings after the divorce." The pastor stood nearby, hands folded gently in front of him. He gave X a reassuring nod, encouraging him to continue. "It helps sometimes," X went on. "But I didn't come to church to talk to a counselor. I came because my friend said this is where people go when they need help with big feelings. He said it's where you talk to God." Elon felt the weight of those words land hard. He had missed so much. He hadn't even known his son was seeing a counselor, hadn't realized how deeply the divorce had affected him. All the meetings, the conferences, the launches, it had all pulled him away from the quiet places where children speak without words. "I don't want to be famous," X said. "I don't want the coolest stuff or the newest things. I just want to talk to my dad. I want to tell him when I'm scared, or when I'm sad, or even when I'm happy." He looked over at Elon again. "I want him to know me," he said, "not just buy me stuff." Elon lowered his head, his throat tight. The ache in his chest deepened with every word. It wasn't anger or shame, it was guilt. Not because he hadn't cared, but because he had truly believed he was doing the best he could. And now, hearing his son speak so plainly, he realized just how far he'd been from what truly mattered. X sat down beside him. Neither of them spoke at first. Elon's eyes stung, his heart pounding beneath the silence. Around them, people were still processing what had just unfolded. Elon leaned slightly toward his son. "You never told me about the counselor," he whispered. X looked up at him, almost apologetically. "You were always busy." Those words hit harder than any accusation. There was no blame in them, just truth. Elon swallowed hard. "I didn't know," he murmured. "I didn't see." He said it more to himself than anyone else, like a confession long overdue, the kind of confession that didn't need a pulpit, just honesty. X looked back toward the altar. "The pastor said that speaking out makes your burdens lighter," he whispered. "I feel lighter now." Elon nodded slowly, his voice barely audible. "I'm glad you spoke." A woman across the aisle dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. An older gentleman near the back bowed his head. The atmosphere in the church had shifted. No longer a quiet service, but something more intimate, more real. A space where love wasn't whispered in polished phrases, but spoken in the honest voice of a child. Elon put his arm gently around X's shoulders. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like the smartest man in the room. He felt like a student. And today his son was the teacher. X nestled back into the pew beside Elon, his small frame brushing against his father's side. The boy's eyes were calm, almost relieved, like someone who had carried a heavy weight and finally set it down. Elon sat motionless beside him, hands clasped tightly in his lap. His face was wet with tears, and he made no attempt to hide them. X looked up at him, concerned. "Dad," he whispered, "are you sad?" Elon shook his head, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "No, buddy, I'm not sad." "Then why are you crying?" Elon drew in a shaky breath, turning toward him. "Because you didn't make me sad, you made me see." X tilted his head slightly. "See what?" "That I've been missing was right in front of me," Elon said, voice thick. "I've been chasing so many big things, but I haven't been chasing you. And that was a mistake." Before X could respond, the pastor approached slowly, his expression kind and reverent. He leaned slightly to speak quietly, respectful. "Your son," the pastor said to Elon, "just reminded this entire room what really matters. He reminded us that being present is more powerful than being impressive." Elon nodded, still overwhelmed. "He reminded me too." The pastor placed a gentle hand on Elon's shoulder. "It's never too late to start seeing clearly," he said softly. then returned to the front to continue the service. As the sound of soft organ music filled the sanctuary again, Elon turned fully to his son. He lowered his voice, making sure X could hear him, but that it remained just between the two of them. "I want to say I'm sorry," Elon said, "for all the times I wasn't there, for being too busy, for thinking work was more important than sitting at a breakfast table with you. I've been absent, and that wasn't fair to you." X looked at him seriously for a long moment. Then, with the innocence only a child can carry, he said, "It's okay, Dad. You're doing important things." Elon smiled through his tears. "Nothing is more important than you. Not anymore. Not ever again." X leaned against his side, resting his head on Elon's arm. "Really?" "Really," Elon said, wrapping his arm around his son's shoulders. "I promise." They sat like that for a while, letting the music wash over them. Around them, the church carried on. The final prayers, the gentle closing of hymnals, the sound of the congregation rising to its feet. But Elon didn't move, not yet, not while X was still nestled against him. He felt something shifting inside, a realignment of priorities, of perspective. The words his son had spoken would not leave him. They had broken something open, and in the breaking, something softer had taken root. "I've got a lot of changing to do," Elon said quietly. X looked up at him, eyes wide and hopeful. "Can I help?" Elon chuckled gently. "I'd like that." They both stood as the final hymn began, but Elon didn't sing. He didn't know the words. Instead, he just watched his son sway gently to the music, his face peaceful, his heart open. And for the first time in a long while, Elon wasn't thinking about the next launch or the next innovation. He was thinking about this moment, right here, right now, and how he never wanted to miss one like it again. The final hymn faded, and people began quietly filing out of the church, stopping to greet the pastor or gather their things. Elon stood with X, ready to leave, but before they stepped into the aisle, X tugged gently on his sleeve. "Can we stay a little longer?" Elon looked down. "Sure, why?" X shrugged. "It's peaceful here." Elon nodded, understanding more than he expected to. They sat back down in the now mostly empty sanctuary. Sunlight poured through the stained glass windows, painting soft colors across their laps. Amber, sapphire, rose. The silence felt full rather than empty. For a while, they didn't speak. Then Elon leaned in slightly. "You were right," he said softly. X turned to him. "About what? About everything? About what matters? About what I've been missing? You didn't just remind me, you taught me." X smiled, quiet and content. They sat together a little longer before Elon broke the silence again. "Can I ask you something?" "Okay. Why didn't you want to go to space camp?" X hesitated. "Because it's 3 weeks long. I'd miss time with you and Mom. I only get half with each of you already." Elon nodded slowly. "That makes sense. What would you rather do?" "There's a regular camp that's just during the day. I could go to that and still come home every night." "We'll do that instead," Elon said without hesitation. "You come first now." X studied his father's face, searching it with those deep, clear eyes. "Even if work gets really busy?" "Even then." X looked thoughtful. "What about Tuesdays?" "What about them?" "You always have meetings on Tuesdays, really important ones." Elon smiled. "We'll reschedule them." X's eyes widened slightly. "What if there's a crisis?" "Then someone else will handle it. Or it'll wait." "I mean it, X. You come first." The boy was quiet for a moment. Then he extended his hand, small and serious. "Can we shake on it?" Elon took his son's hand and gave it a firm, solemn shake. "It's a deal." They sat together a few more minutes, letting the moment settle like soft dust in the sunlight. No pressure, no rush. Just a father and son in a quiet church, beginning something new. For Elon, it felt like the first time in years he was exactly where he needed to be. In the weeks that followed, Elon made good on his promise. Meetings that once filled every corner of his schedule were moved, delegated, or canceled entirely. He carved out time, not just on weekends, but on school nights, on Tuesdays, and on the days he used to reserve for deadlines and launches. It wasn't easy. Old habits tugged at him, and the demands of his work never truly lessened. But he kept showing up, and X noticed. At first it was small things. The boy became less tense at bedtime. He started talking more at dinner. He laughed more often, smiled more freely. Then came bigger shifts. Questions about life, stories from school, jokes that turned into long conversations. His drawings changed too. Fewer robots, more people, more color. Evenings became sacred. They cooked together, simple meals that ended with messy dishes and full hearts. They read books, played strategy games, and worked on building model rockets. Not for missions or Mars, but just because it was fun. X started keeping a journal. Elon didn't read it, but he noticed it was always close by. One night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars rise over the horizon, X leaned his head against his father's shoulder. "Dad?" he asked softly. "Yeah, buddy. You remember when I talked in church and made you cry?" Elon looked down at him and smiled, the memory still vivid. "I remember." "I was scared you'd be mad," X admitted, "for saying all that stuff." "I wasn't mad," Elon said gently, putting his arm around his son. "I was grateful." X looked up at him, surprised. "Really?" "It was the most important thing anyone's ever said to me," Elon replied. "You told me the truth, and it changed everything." X didn't respond right away. He just nodded, a quiet understanding in his eyes. Above them, the stars blinked silently, a sky full of possibilities. And for the first time in a long while, Elon wasn't thinking about what he hadn't done or what he still needed to build. He was simply thankful for what he had, and who he was finally learning to become. That night, after brushing teeth and choosing a book, Elon tucked X into bed. The room was dim, filled with the soft hum of the night. X pulled the covers up to his chin, the edges of a worn picture book poking out from under his pillow. "Dad," he said, voice drowsy but clear, "do you think church is always like that?" Elon smiled as he sat on the edge of the bed. "Not always," he said honestly. "But maybe it should be." X nodded sleepily. "I liked how it felt, like everybody listened." Elon leaned down and kissed the top of his son's head. "They did. You reminded them what matters most." As X's eyes began to close, Elon stayed there for a moment, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. A peace had settled between them. Earned, not given. This wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. Elon turned off the light and stepped into the hallway, looking out the window at the sky beyond. The stars blinked overhead, unchanged but somehow different. Sometimes, the most extraordinary change begins with the smallest voice. If this inspiring story touched your heart, subscribe now for more stories of faith, family, and second chances.